Market Journal, television for agricultural business decisions, is a presentation of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine.
Hello everyone, I'm Troy Moling and thanks for joining us today on Market Journal. Hope everyone had a wonderful Christmas. On today's show, we're bringing you some of our biggest stories from 2019. And starting off our broadcast, it's an event that will define agriculture this year. Massive flooding across Nebraska destroyed homes, engulfed roads, and turned rural towns into islands. Words used to describe the flooding were catastrophic, historic, and record-breaking. But no matter what you called it, it's an event that will never be forgotten. And Market Journal was there from the very beginning. Bill Dodd has this report.
Here's the water. This is our alfalfa field.
The pictures are devastating. Rushing water, impassable streets, and farms turned into lakes. Meteorologists say high snow totals in February, melting in March, and the recent bomb cyclone made conditions right for the perfect storm and some of the worst flooding the state has seen in decades.
Right before this event, we had a couple snowstorms with high wind that blew a lot of the snow into ditches, backed up culverts, and we had the big significant ice accumulation. So in all this combination, the rain on the snow causing the melt, warmer temperatures, that also additional melt, water flowing in off of very steep slopes. We're in an area of the state that has a lot of terrain changes over short distances. All of these just led to a combination of factors that led to an unbelievable flood event.
Flooding impacted about 2/3 of the state, with much of it concentrated along the Platte, Elkhorn, and Missouri rivers.
The damage is devastating. It's gone. It looks like a tornado went through, or an avalanche, or anything that wipes out everything in its path. The water and the couple times where they had walls of water that moved through took debris and ice with it. And so it's not just water running around poles, it's water knocking poles over. So I would imagine as this water recedes away, it'll look very destructive behind it.
The damage won't be fully known until the water goes down, but the cost could rival 4 Nebraska floods that occurred in the spring and summer of 1950.
But when you think about what it cost in terms of hourly wage compared to 50 years ago, it's not going to take long for this to really run its course up in terms of values. And honestly, based on the amount of cattle losses and the uncertainty, you've got farmers that may not be able to plant, maybe not get to their fields because they're cut off due to depending where they lie within the river and bridges cut off. I think that we're probably somewhere in the $500 million to $1 billion range, and it may even go higher depending on if we see additional precipitation events on top of this before the rivers go back within their bank.
Planting is already delayed, and for some farmers will have to be canceled completely. Not only do these producers have to deal with saturated fields, but what the waters will leave behind.
Those rivers, they take sediment with it, and they deposit it someplace, and a lot of times it's right on those fields that are along the river. So if you have a lot of extra sediment that's sitting on top, logs, debris, it'll take some time to clean that up, and you have to sort of bring that topsoil back to life before you even want to put a seed back out there.
Cattle producers are also feeling the impacts through loss of animals or long-term health.
If they're gone or not alive, there's an instant impact right away. Long-term, I think, will be some calf health. I think as people go now and they're moving cows out of their pens out into pasture because it's too muddy, they'll run out of grass earlier than probably what they would have been because they typically don't go to grass for another couple months. So those could be impacts that we could see later this summer.
Williams encourages those affected to check with their local insurance agent and FSA office to mitigate their losses as best they can, and also to try to keep a positive attitude.
People say it all the time, you see the good in people when the worst things come. And I think that's what a lot of people probably realize, that the neighbors that are thinking about them, the people that are from across the country that are calling, the people that are hauling hay from Texas and Kansas and Oklahoma up to Nebraska. I mean, it's hard, but the sun will shine and the water will drain away. So we'll keep plugging away and keep working on it.
Reporting for Market Journal, I'm Bill Dodd.
Wow, powerful story for sure. Next up, being a farmer always comes with stress, but it seems like this year, with the weather and market uncertainty, the anxiety was even more noticeable. Susan Harris-Broomfield is a Nebraska Extension educator focused on rural health, wellness, and safety. We spoke to get an idea of how serious farm depression and suicide is.
Unfortunately, it is quite prevalent. It's an industry where there are a lot of pressures: the weather, the unknown markets, family issues. All of these things can collapse onto a farmer or a rancher, and it's one of the higher rated suicide occupations.
Do you find that it's hard for people in the ag community to reach out for help?
Absolutely, and for several reasons.
Okay.
The two main reasons are stigma and accessibility. You know, in Nebraska in general, there is still a definite stigma with mental health, and even the word mental brings up negative images. When it's health, you know, it's just like physical health, there is mental health, and we have to take care of both. But it's difficult for us to think about that in Nebraska, and especially with our farmers and ranchers who are tough, they're strong, they're used to taking care of themselves. They're not used to asking for help. They don't want to ask for help. And more importantly, with that stigma is that they would have to be seen, you know, their pickup or their vehicle would be in front of the counselor's office, and they don't want that. They don't think it's, you know, a healthy thing to have happen to them.
How do we go about changing that perception?
Oh gosh, I think more information out there is crucial. I think the more we educate, the more people understand that mental health is just like physical health. We all have issues, we all need to deal with them. And even if you have to start with your doctor, you know, because accessibility is really difficult in Nebraska. If you go to your doctor with a physical condition, it might very well be related to a mental issue going on. And I'm hoping that doctors out there will be asking the correct questions to dig into these issues.
What are some signs that family members can look for?
For depression?
Yeah.
Definitely changes in mood, changes in behavior, changes in the way that a person goes about their day. Are they able to live and love and laugh like they used to, or do they seem like they're more in a box and more isolated and not doing their social things that they used to go out and do? You know, if they had a coffee club every week, are they still doing that, or are they kind of just being a hermit at home? Those kinds of things.
And for family members left behind after a suicide, do you find that they're at a higher risk for suicide themselves, or just more problems in their life in general?
Yes, and I can't remember the statistic offhand, but there is a statistic that says that if the family member left behind does not get help or support within a certain amount of time, their risk is much higher for suicide and for mental health and physical health issues. It's really important. You know, people don't think about that when someone dies, and especially by suicide. Everybody's there all at once to help, and that's great. Support is great. But then everybody goes home, and they kind of forget about this person, and they leave that issue behind. And I think it's important to just keep checking up with that person and make sure they have a support system, and hopefully even some professional help if necessary.
What are some resources that Extension provides to help with suicide, depression, things like that?
Well, at Extension, we have recently formed a mental health work group to work on just collecting every resource that we are aware of. We're bringing in outside sources to our work group, so it's not just Extension people. And we've put together a list that you can find on our website at extension.unl.edu. And so if you were to look into that site, you would find this list it's called Staying Connected During Tough Times. And it lists resources that many people don't know about, like our Rural Response Hotline. It offers attorneys, financial help, counselors, mediators, just all kinds of issues, and maybe some free vouchers for services for certain people. So that's a great one. The National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, the Veterans Crisis Line, Boys Town, and then there's another one that a lot of people do not know about. It's called LOSS, L-O-S-S, and that's for local outreach to suicide survivors. And that's for people who have suffered a suicide in their life. And this particular group has teams of individuals, professionals around the state, about 10 of them, I think, and they are sent out to talk with people who have lost someone due to suicide, and they are the best support you can imagine. So you can Google that one and find it online.
Thanks again to Susan. That's a difficult topic, but something that needs to be talked about. And we've posted a link to Extension and information to Nebraska Loss on our website at marketjournal.unl.edu. Time for weather now, and in place of our usual weekly forecast, we're speaking with Nebraska climatologists Martha Shulski and Al Dutcher about the year in weather for 2019. And from storms to snow to flooding, it was a wild one. So Martha, we'll start with you. If you could give us a recap of what we saw this past winter in Nebraska, some of the highlights.
Yeah, the winter of 2018-2019 was pretty interesting. So Lincoln and Omaha both did set records for snowfall totals. They were both over 50 inches. The winter season as a whole, December, January, February, was 7th coldest on record, or 7th wettest on record for the state. And that was primarily for the eastern 2/3 of the state, not necessarily in the panhandle. We were slightly cooler than normal for December, January, February. But the big news came in February. That's where we were in the top 10 coldest on record, going back to 1895 for the whole state of Nebraska.
And Al, let's move on to you for a second. Was there anything that happened in 2018 that indicated that 2019 was going to be a particularly messy winter?
The only thing that we really had going for us in terms of moisture was that area that was persistently wet in southern Minnesota, northern Iowa, northeast Nebraska, southeastern South Dakota. The major issue is that we had an ample amount of moisture and a very wet pattern that was highlighted by an El Nino, so the southerly flow was very extensive last winter, and most of our heavy precip up through the end of January was confined to the central southern plains, not the northern plains. It is in February where we're seeing that switch to the very cold pattern. It took extraordinary circumstances first to get to the point that we got to with all the flooding this spring.
And then Martha, when we get into March, we had that flooding. How did the impacts from all the snowfall in January and February and even into March contribute to that flooding?
Yeah, so the stage was really set. We had a very cold February that allowed the soils that were already saturated because we had been so wet over a long period of time to freeze deeply. So we've got this frozen saturated soils. We've got a few inches of water equivalent in the snowpack sitting on the ground, so that when we did have that March blizzard that came through 13th and 14th, we had blizzard conditions in the west and then rain in the east, and that allowed for a pretty rapid snow melt. And so the ice that was sitting on the rivers, the snow that was sitting on the landscape, it had nowhere to go. It was not infiltrating into the ground.
And what happened with the snow and the flooding really set the stage for a terrible year for producers. What commodity was the one that was most impacted?
That's a tough one. Of course, corn was really impacted during planting, and we've seen the worst of those situations over extreme eastern Nebraska, northeast, and then points off to our east and north. But one of the things that's kind of been missed, and I've been hearing a lot about this, has been we had a great forage growth with all the rainfall, but it had contained a lot of water, didn't have the protein content. We had a lot of problems with calving, lost cattle during the floods, but more importantly, as we get back into the breeding portion of the equation in the fall, there is some talk, at least, that conditioning due to the low protein content of these large amounts of forages was a contributing factor in some of the lower take rates basically through the breeding. So I think both sides could argue this, but in this early part of the year, I think corn was a bigger impact outside of the losses that we had during calving. At the fall, I think the biggest issue for us is going to be conception rates on the cattle that were coming in to be breeding.
And then Martha, when we move on to spring and summer, compared to what we saw earlier in the year, fairly mild, but what were some of the high points here?
Yeah, so the heavy precipitation that we could get, that kind of continued into the summer. So in early July, the Kearney area and really about a 10-county area in Nebraska received over 4 inches of rainfall in a 2-day period. I believe the highest total was almost 9 inches near Loomis, which is a very high total for a 2-day period. So the Kearney area did experience some impacts. Later in the summer, the Ainsworth area, they experienced quite a bit of precipitation in a 2-day period that did hamper some flood recovery efforts. So there were some cases of high-intensity convective rainfall events that did happen. And August, in fact, was the wettest on record in Nebraska, again going back to 1895. So we continue that wet trend that we did have. And in fact, 2019 year to date, so January through November, we are 4th wettest on record.
All right, and Al, I'll have you look at the Al Dutcher crystal ball here, predicting what could be in store for 2020. What are you thinking right now?
It's been a tough call. You know, I actually thought it would be a lot more stormier here in the Central Plains than what we have seen. We have seen an active weather pattern, but most of the systems have passed to the north or to the south of us. Last year we were in an El Nino. We had a lot of southerly flow type direction. This year we're seeing more, at least in October and November, most of our flow was coming out of the northerly flow. We had 24 straight days in Omaha with below normal temperatures, kind of eerily similar to the same setup that we had during February with the cold push of Arctic air into our region. So as long as we don't freeze this ground up, we can get a semblance of decent normal precipitation and not excessively heavy snowfall, we have a chance to mitigate some of this flooding, because as long as that ground isn't froze, anything on the surface that's still standing there will work its way down into the deeper profile.
Thanks again to Martha and Al for joining me. Moving on, while many this year were recovering from this spring's bomb cyclone and subsequent flooding, another disaster was around the corner. In July, the collapse of an irrigation canal threatened over 107,000 acres in Wyoming and the Nebraska Panhandle during the peak of the summer growing season. Market Journal's Bill Dodd went out to Western Nebraska to learn more.
Father, we come before you now with concern in our hearts for the things that are going on in our valley. There is a time for everything. There's a time to plant, a time to harvest, a time to cultivate, a time to water.
It all began with a prayer. A crisis in Nebraska's Panhandle and several of Wyoming's eastern counties that cut off irrigation for multiple agricultural producers is now threatening entire crops. The Irrigation Tunnel Collapse is currently being viewed as an act of God, though there is no official cause for the collapse. This prompted a public meeting last week at the University of Nebraska Panhandle Research and Extension Center to inform farmers and landowners of what is currently known about the collapse, how it occurred, and what's happening in the response effort. While recovery efforts were currently underway at the time, the cause and solutions were still a bit elusive to some officials at the helm.
At present, we've talked to engineers as pure speculation. We do not know exactly what the cause of it was.
Yeah, this is a really interesting situation. The canal system here was built by the Bureau of Reclamation in the early 1900s, and then those canals are maintained by local irrigation districts, and there are 2 districts that are responsible for this tunnel. And so as we were looking at a structure of its age and the extremely wet weather events that we've had this year, that makes it really difficult to pinpoint a cause and then who's responsible for this canal break.
For now, crews are virtually working around the clock in order to get water flowing again. Officials are currently aiming for a 20-day target to resolve the situation. In the meantime, producers are holding out hope for measurable rainfall and favorable weather conditions over the coming days, as now is a crucial time for the crops to be irrigated, and with farmers' livelihoods on the line, it can't come soon enough. Nebraska Extension Irrigation Management Specialist Xin Xiao explained to me just how crops could be affected by this disaster.
So for corn and beans, I don't think it's too optimistic. They are at their critical growth stage. Corn is at their reproductive stage from V12 to blister. So this is the stage they need most water. Same thing for dry edible beans. They're about to flowering, and some they already are. Again, they need water at this stage. So if it's really stressed at this point, and for next few weeks, corn will be a total loss, and there might be some left on the beans. And for sugar beets, that's probably the most optimistic crop in this situation.
While authorities are trying to get a fix in place, producers are scrambling to figure out alternative solutions to get water on their crops. Unfortunately, on both counts, there are a litany of legal hoops to jump through, as well as agencies to notify at varying levels of government. While discussing the cost and procedures of fixing the situation, Rick Preston, general manager of Gering-Fort Laramie Irrigation District, described himself as a bull in a china shop, eager to get in, tear down, and rebuild as fast as possible, and at the same time articulated the frustrations that come with a situation like this.
The first 2 or 3 days, we were in an aggressive mode to start putting it back together, to do whatever was necessary to get the system up and running again. And after about the 3rd day, we started having to deal with laws, statutes, channels to have to go through. And after about the 5th day, I was ready to yank anybody that opened their mouth up to yank their lips off. It is a very, very frustrating, very irritating law when you're in a hurry to try to save the livelihood of individuals. But regardless of nevertheless, you have to back up and take a breath and readdress it in a manner that's civil and level-headed. So,
as of now, as we mentioned earlier, crews are working around the clock to get a temporary solution in place while a permanent fix is being worked out. The final price tag on the project is estimated to cost upward of $10 million. As far as where the money will come from and how insurance deals with the affected farmers and landowners is still up in the air pending an investigation into the cause of the collapse. And that investigation will commence just as soon as crews have water running again. Until then, many producers and officials are in a hurry-up-and-wait mode as they continue to work as fast as they can to ensure producers in the area have a little peace of mind. Reporting for Market Journal, I'm Bill Dodd.
Officials say interim repair work on the tunnel is already underway. Finally today, this was one of our most talked about stories this year. A photographer's lens can capture some of the rawest of human emotions: surprise, joy, sadness, or defeat. And this year in agriculture offered all that and more. Earlier this year, we visited a photo exhibit at UNL's Great Plains Art Museum that aimed to show a collection of farmers in a new light. Check out what happens when art and agriculture come together.
My practice as an artist is really less about communicating or provoking. It's much more about asking questions and exploring. And so for me, the photography, the pictures, the camera, it's a way to interact. It's an excuse to talk to people.
Each wall tells a story. Each image evokes an emotion. The subjects are familiar, serving as representations of members of your own family, a friend, or even yourself. The new Farmers exhibition is the brainchild of photographer Brian Darby, designer Tim Hostler, and sociologist Dr. Paul Stock. While teaching in Kansas, Brian and Paul met at a faculty workshop and quickly discovered a shared interest in food and farming. What began as an idea to snap a few photos and learn about the area has now morphed into a collaborative research project, touted as an observation of today's independent farmer.
It started with Brian making friends at our local farmers market. But then once you get into this world, you gain trust, you earn friendship, and you start to meet other people. So in sociology, we would call it snowball sampling, where you start with the metaphor being you start at the top and it builds from there.
Tim, a designer with a fondness for experimental narratives, rounded out the team. As the trio's reputation grew across the Kansas farming community, so did the families who wanted to be involved. Since beginning the project in 2014, 15 farms have been showcased and countless more photos have been taken. To keep with the new farmers theme, everyone involved agreed the subjects would be new to farming or experienced producers trying something different. The finished project would serve as an outlet for farmers to tell their stories and a visual reminder of what American agriculture can achieve.
There was something about the life, about the ability to grow food, to be a part of the community differently. So there's that newness we focused on, but always about trying to innovate and be entrepreneurial.
What are the conventions? Are there other ways of doing things? Are there ways that are being overlooked? Or what are the new experimental things? So that was the kind of envelope that wrapped around the pictures.
Brian chose to take the photos with a large view camera. The complicated equipment extended the length of the shoots and encouraged more trust and interaction with the participants. But what about the black and white?
Black and white is inexpensive. It's still expensive. Each one of these has a dollar price attached to it just in the processing of making it. But it was the most inexpensive route. So that's one way I like, one reason for using black and white. I like black and white also because it is less literal, right? Color photographs are quite literal. Black and white removes us one step from that. So right away it kind of allows us to more easily talk about, mythology or metaphor, and to kind of dig in a little bit deeper level.
About 50 photos made it into the final exhibit. Farmers in the field, farmers at home, families united in their love for the land and one another. Each photo speaking to the viewer in a different way.
There are these unexpected stories sitting out there that aren't being told.
The new farmers exhibit has been shown across the plains, at Harvard, Yale, and even a university in Switzerland. And as those stories are told and more people are reached, farming becomes more than corn, beans, or cattle. It becomes a journey of self-discovery and understanding one's place in contemporary agriculture.
This whole experience was really great, just getting to know the people and getting to get to know them, getting to know their families, getting to know their farms. And then just kind of this work is sort of like in some ways it's a gift to them, I guess. Like it's something that we wanted to do for them, but then to also get this research out.
It's really transcended anything that any one of us could have ever really imagined. And that speaks to both their talent, but also the teamwork and collaboration that we've put into this. And it really did evolve. I think what I'm most proud of is this kind of doesn't fit into our normal research categories of how you set up a team. And it was just something that we wanted to do and see where it went. And so to now see it up in 2 museums and a couple publications come out of it and some small research money that's come with it, it really goes to show what can happen if you follow kind of your passion rather than some of the grant dollars.
Paul, Tim, and Brian have a plan to turn the photos and farmer interviews into a book. That's pretty cool. That's going to do it for this week's show and all our shows for 2019. If you missed a story, be sure to download the Market Journal mobile app or follow us on social media to join in on the conversation. It's been a great year hosting Market Journal. We'll see you next week for our first show of 2020. I'm Troy Moling. Thanks for watching and Happy New Year.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources.